Hello and welcome to Conversations from the ANF podcast. In this episode, I speak to Christelle, an adult transracial adoptee. She shares her experience of being adopted as a 10-year-old girl from a Madagascan orphanage by a French family she'd never met until she was flown to their home in the south of France. Christelle's experience is stark, and she's open and honest in relation to the impact on her and the challenges that has manifest. She now supports adoptees as well as raising awareness of adoption issues through visual arts. As always, if you have experience of adoption, fostering or special guardianship from any perspective, personal or professional, and would like to share that on the podcast, please do get in touch through the Facebook page or Twitter, or you can email us at andfpodcast@gmail.com.
My name is Christelle and I am based in between the UK and Portugal at the moment. I am coach, so most of my work is really around working with adoptees and coaching them to navigate a journey of adoption. But I'm also a multidisciplinary artist and a curator, so I do a lot of work in the cultural space. I run fashion shows. I do a lot of work around short film, so anything visual culture is where I work. And previous to that, I did a lot of work also in education. So I worked for 10-15 years in the education sector, in education management. So I used to travel quite a lot around different country doing education programs. So that's me. In terms of my adoption journey, it all started in Madagascar. That's where I was born. And so the journey in Madagascar was, my adoption didn't start straight away. I was 10 when I was adopted from Madagascar to south of France. But before I get adopted, I was, so my mother passed away when I was about 6-7, and she left me with the Catholic missionary that were working in the village at the time. And from the Catholic missionary, I was put into, what do you call it? I've lost my thoughts. Orphanage, that's it, yep. Sorry. So from the Catholic missionary, I was put into an orphanage, and then from the orphanage, I was adopted in France. So I've done quite a few movements already before I get adopted. So I arrived in France, I was 10, which is quite unusual for intercultural, intercountry adoption to be adopted at that age, because you've already got quite a lot of knowledge about yourself and a lot of memories. So they don't normally do that kind of adoption. And so I was adopted at age 10. I arrived in south of France, not knowing the language, culture shock, and everything to go with it, because I ended up in a very tiny village in south of France. So there was not many people my color or with my culture in the village at the time. And for me, at the time, it was just about surviving, I suppose. It was just getting along and trying to fit into the system, to the culture, and not really asking many questions. But looking back, I know that, I needed a lot more support in that sense, in terms of trying to adapt to a new culture, to adapting to a new family. And especially, like I said, I was 10. I had all this memory from my past that was hanging behind me. So I was kind of caught up in between two cultures. So it was quite difficult to navigate at the time. And I didn't realize how much that story kind of impacted myself later on in my adult life. So I did my early education in France, and then I came to the UK to do my university years. And as you do, you end up staying. Life makes you settle down. So I stayed in the UK for about 25 years. And then last year, I decided that I needed something new as well. So I've kind of just trying to move to Portugal. So I've been here since September, but I'm still coming back to the UK quite a lot for work and for different opportunities. So that's mostly my journey. And I think now I'm working with adoptees because for me, navigating that adoption journey was very difficult for me. So it's now for me an opportunity to support other adoptees for them to go through that process because it's not easy. Like I say, we don't tend to have much support from the system, from the agencies or from families. And I think it's really important, especially when you come from a different culture to where you are being adopted. And I think representation is so important. And when you have to grow up in an environment where there is no representation at all, you kind of lose yourself, especially at age 10 when you are starting to build some kind of identity. Then you are thrown into a different culture with no explanation. It gets very, very difficult then to navigate who you are. And even little things like what you want to do in life is really difficult because it's just absorbing new things. And it's almost like a brainwashing in a way because you're taking all these new things and you don't really have any choice or any say in the matter. It's just trying to fit in. So that's making very confused about who you are, all your past. It sounds like it's almost like your past didn't matter. You've got all this new culture you need to learn about and you need to embrace and you have to get along with it. So that's created quite a lot of confusion. And that's part of the reason I am supporting other adoptees now to go through that transition in life and hopefully help making their life a little bit easier as we go along. And also, I think for me, one of the difficult part that I found with my adoption is, I've done a lot of work in the culture space, I said earlier, and I've done work in theatre. So have explored my adoption story through telling it through theatre pieces. So I explore, for example, an area around my name. So Christelle is not actually my birth name. So that was the name that I was given when I was 10, when I was adopted. And again, as part of my identity, I found that very difficult because at age 10, you've been called by a certain name and then suddenly you have to respond to a completely different name. And I think when you are young enough, if you are adopted as a baby, you might not notice the difference, but I think age 10, it does make a difference. And that's also a very confusing place to be. So it's almost like a split of personality in a way. You've got like up to age 10, you're called this person. And then from age 10, you have to take on this new identity with a brand new name. Is one thing that I found difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of describing that, and it is unusual for older children. When we think of adoption, we often think of younger children, babies and infants. So can I ask you about that process? I mean, did you know obviously you're a little girl who's experienced a terrible loss and then put into an orphanage, which can be complicated environments, and especially in a country where childcare has got a different culture and a different expectation, a different standard. So did you know that the plan was for you to be adopted? Were you aware of what was going on?
Not at all. I think I've become aware. I mean, because my memory is not that clear about the time scale of how long things happen. I can't remember exactly how long I was at the missionary. There was a mention already when I was at the Catholic missionary that some family in France were going to look after me. But at the time, even the word adoption, I didn't know what that meant. And then I was put into the orphanage. So I thought then that's what they told me about this family in France was not happening, because then I spent quite a long time at the orphanage. And from my memory, it felt like almost like instantly from one day to the next, I was on the plane and going off to France with not much notice about, you are going to this family now. So the last time I remember was when I was at the Catholic missionary, that I was mentioned that, I received some photograph of the family and I was told I was going to go there, but Yeah, not much
I mean,
information.
just telling the story, it sort of feels like from such a different time. You would hope that that wouldn't be what happens now, but the fact you've not even met these people, moved to a country where you don't speak a language, that 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 feels like almost, well, it feels like a cruel thing to do to a 10-year-old, if I'm honest.
It is. I mean, like I said, at the time, I didn't really know much what everything meant, but it's in my adulthood when we're thinking about it. It's, I wouldn't dream to have to do that to any child, to, take it from one culture to another at that age. Because, I mean, it's hard enough to be adopted as a baby because it still affects you. But I think it's when you have all those memories, it's really difficult because you also don't know what happened to your family. It's the same village. From one day to the next, I don't see my family anymore. And, in my head, they've got all this question. And it's almost, for many years, I felt like my family completely abandoned me. And because I couldn't understand, well, we are in the same village, I'm not seeing them anymore. I know my mother left me with this Catholic missionary, but I didn't understand why my grandparents were not coming or why my brother, my uncles were not coming. I went back in 2010 to Madagascar and visited my family. So my uncle, I mean, it's again, where I grew up in Madagascar is a very rural places. So my grandparents will live in a completely very, very rural. So you would have to cross rivers and walk for miles to get to where I was living. So my uncle and my grandparents were not even aware that I got adopted. They didn't really know. So when I went back, this is probably 25 years later. So they didn't even know where I was or if I was still alive. So that was also a bit of a shock to know that they didn't know I was adopted. And also I then found out that, at the time, we're talking about, so I was born in the 70s and Madagascar gained independence from France in the 60s. So we're talking about just 10 years difference between the independence and when I was born. So my grandparents are those generation of people who would have had to face colonization by France. So I think I then realized when I went back that my grandparents should not have come anywhere near the French at the time. Even if they knew I would have been left there by my mother. So I think they would have just stayed away and decided this is the mother's decision. We're not going to get involved. So there's still that bitterness and that pain that they went through the colonization. So I think for them, they couldn't understand why I would even be put to the French for that time. So yeah, it's quite complex.
I mean, you're smiling and you're laughing and it's very good humored, but I mean, it's really quite a dark story, isn't it?
It is. I can laugh about it now. I didn't laugh about it when I went back in 2010. It was a very emotional journey. I didn't. When I went back to do some charity work. I didn't even went back to say I was going to meet my birth family. It's only when I arrived there that I decided, okay, I'm going to the village where I grew up and see what happened. And I did find my half sisters and my uncles. So it just led. Eventually, I ended up having to go to where my grandparents lived, and it turned out to be more of a reunion than I expected. So I found out a lot more about my story and my family's story at the time. But it was very emotional. It's because I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't planning to do that. But it was just I was thrown into it in the middle of my trip. So it was. I mean, now I think because I've processed so much of it over the years, I can talk about it and see the irony of it, the whole story, how how I ended up being adopted by the people who colonized my home country. So, but I know it's not my adoptive parents' fault either. So, so I'm not the colonizer, but the story is there, and yeah, it's difficult to assimilate the two. And also that's very confusing in terms of identity because, part of me grew up in France and my adoptive family is French. So part of me is French somewhere, but my heart is definitely belong to Madagascar and to Africa. But to try to reconcile the two at times is very difficult, especially when you think about history and what the French did to my country. And yeah, I did a whole project on African queens, and I did a project on the last African queen, the last Malagasy queen that the French exiled away. So they completely removed her from Madagascar. And even going from that story and telling that story, because I was dressing up as the queen and telling her story. Yeah. That was very emotional in itself, because for me, somehow I've embraced that the French side of me, but yet they've done so much damage in my country. And yeah, it's a very difficult story to put the two together, and yet it is part of me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of thinking through, because obviously I didn't know very much before we started to talk, which is how we do all the interviews. And just as you're talking, I'm trying to reconcile so many different things, because on a very personal level, you've been there's this severance, isn't there, between your history, your family, your identity, your culture, your but then there's this bigger picture played out as an act of colonialism almost, that that this black, then the echoes to the story of the Queen being exiled, you being exiled. You go, blimey. I mean, you talk about working through stuff. Can I ask, it's maybe a personal question, but where do you even start? Was there a moment when a light bulb went on and you thought, oh, hang on, how I feel is got to be linked to my experience of adoption and being adopted?
Yeah, I think it's all come back from that trip to Madagascar. I think it was so emotional that after that trip, I had to learn a lot more about my African history. So that's when I actually completely changed area of work. So I went from education to working with community, and I was working a lot more with African and Caribbean community and telling about African history. So for me, it was really important that I start to know a little bit more about Madagascar and Africa. Because also when I went to Madagascar, I felt like I didn't belong, because I've left such a long time ago. I didn't speak the language anymore. I don't know much about the culture. I didn't have any connection with the country. So I felt like I was there, but not belonging to that country. So for me, it was at that moment, it was like, hold on a moment, you need to reconnect to your roots and really understand where you're coming from. And so, yeah, it's really stemmed from that trip. But also, I think, emotion-wise, I think I don't know how that's happened for sure. But I starting to analyze, and also I think in terms of doing some type of therapy, I began to understand that some of the emotion that I've kept inside, I think, suppressed over the years, was linked to my story. I've learned to just fit in places and get myself small and not really being myself. So I had it to come out of myself. And I think that's when I started again to do a lot of creative work, doing the theater, and putting myself out there to really try to discover who I was exactly and what I like to do. And so, yeah, that has been a long journey of discovering who I am and my identity. And I think it's kind of a journey that is still continuing as I go along. And I also done some DNA tests to really understand, because Madagascar is a very mixed, diverse community as well. So, for my DNA, I also found out that I've got some Indonesian blood in me. So that was also very interesting to know, because majority of my blood is from Africa, but also being to know that I've got other part of me from different part of the world was very good for me to know. So yeah, it's a process in itself, and I think you have to keep going to get out. I mean, adoptees talk about coming out of the fog, and I think that's probably what happened to me when I came back from that trip in Madagascar. I felt so many different emotions at the time. I had to find a way to process what I was feeling and what it meant, and it wasn't always easy. But I think if I didn't have any support and having all this therapy, different modality that I've experienced over the years, have helped me to try to find the more authentic side of me rather than what I've been told I should be. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's so many questions, but I'm going to kind of contain myself a little bit. Can I ask then, in terms of France's, that route where you was a 10-year-old taken to France, were you an exception, or was there lots of children that happened to, or a number of children? Is there a community of people like yourself who sort of experienced that sort of post-colonial, whatever, kickback?
At the time, the agency through which my parents used, it was several of us. Because on that plane journey that I went to France, it was 3 or 4 of us arrived on that same day in France. And also that agency used to run like a yearly reunion. So for all the children that I've adopted from Madagascar, so we'll have a reunion so we can meet up every year. But because I moved to the UK, I've lost track of most of the people. But I mean, there was few people who were not 10-year-old, but I would say 8 or 7, who were already quite big. So I don't think it was, I don't know if it's because Madagascar just made exceptions. But yes, there's quite a few people who are older. I've also got a sister that has been adopted from Madagascar. We are not blood related, but she's also from Madagascar. But she was adopted. She was 2 years old, so very different story. She can't really remember much of that journey, but again, our adoption is the way we experience our adoption is very different, because she doesn't want to know at all about her background. She hasn't been back to Madagascar, and she's not really interested at the moment. She keeps saying yes, maybe next year, but she hasn't been back since. Whereas for me, I needed to know. It was so important. And I think it's because also I had all these memories. I mean, for years, I keep repeating in my head, because we used to live in a fishing village. So I used to repeat in my head, not to forget the route that I used to take from my house to the seaside. So I couldn't forget some of those little tiny pieces of information. So I think that's what really kept me going, because I really wanted to remember. And actually, when I went back and to visit, that journey in my head seems to be like it was very far away, but actually it was very close. So your memory as a child is already, it's not as accurate as you think it is. So it's very difficult that's why I found it difficult for some of my memories to be so accurate, because as a child, your memory is not the same as you have now. So some of my memories, it's very vague, really. Yeah.
And do you and I was thinking about your adoptive parents, and what is their perspective on adoption now? You're a woman. You've tried to make sense of what you experienced, and how do they see it now? Because I'm sure they thought they were doing a good thing.
Well, that's an interesting question, because that's one thing I still need to do, is to speak to my adoptive parents about how they're feeling about it, because we have not really spoken about it. I think when I was trying to find myself, I kind of distanced myself a lot from my adoptive parents. We still speak, but we don't speak about, this type of thing.
Yeah.
And I still, I go back and I still say I'm going home to go to France, which is interesting in itself. But yeah, I've not had that deep conversation to see, because for me, it would be if I start that conversation, it's going to be very deep, and I have to address the whole colonization and the white savior. And I know that my adoptive family is a Catholic, so there is that link with the Catholic missionary. So I was adopted for the church. So there is that part of wanting to do good. But the way I have lived my adoption is also, I am grateful. We have to be grateful. We always been told to be grateful for being an adoptee, for what we have. And I am grateful for all the education and all the opportunity I've had. But at the same time, I also have to acknowledge that it hasn't been an easy journey. And adoption has not made our life better in certain ways, because you still have to face all the trauma, and nobody has helped us with that side of the trauma. So that's quite intense. So at some point, if I speak to my parents, I have to address those deep issues, because it has affected me in my adult life. So it's quite important. So I think I need to find the right time and the right place to start that conversation.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't even think my parents realize also how much trauma was attached to my adoption. And I think that also is what I blame a lot of the adoption agency for not doing any work before they adopt children, because you just bring a child into a family thinking like everything is okay, but that child has had a life before, and you don't know what they've been through. And as part of some of the therapy I had to do, I was even surprised myself. I had to, one of the therapy session, I had to take like a list of trauma that I've been in life, and I pretty much had all the tick on that boxes. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've been through this, but actually taking it for granted. I didn't actually realize this was actually a trauma. And we're talking about, we take things for granted, like natural disaster. So when I was a child in Madagascar, I went for a big cyclone. So our house got destroyed. My mother nearly died also during that period. So for a 4 or 5 year old, that's quite traumatic in itself. But adoptive parents would not get no information about such an event, because also the adoption agency would not have that information, because I don't think they are interested in finding out what has been happening in that child's life before they get adopted. So I think it does create a lot of difficulty for that child and for that adult when they move on. And I wish there's a way for adoption agency to put a little bit more effort into finding out more about the child and how the child can be supported in terms of, emotional, but also cultural support when they get adopted. And I think that will really help. And also for the family, I think family needs support in that sense as well. I mean, when I see stories about families giving back a difficult child because they can't cope with it, I get really angry and frustrated, because, that child is not being difficult because it's difficult. That child will probably have a lot of trauma, and it's his way of expressing that trauma. But as an adult, we automatically think, oh, it's too difficult to handle. And for me, that is really difficult to accept and to tolerate. So I think there's need a lot more structure in terms of what is training. Yeah.
I'm surprised, because what I'm seeing is you're not talking in terms of adoption needs to be abolished. you're talking in terms of like, oh, let's change adoptions. I'm surprised because I shouldn't presume, but from your story, I would say, well, wouldn't it be reasonable that you'd thought adoption shouldn't happen?
I mean, I'm not against not having adoption at all. I think there's place for it, but it's depends on the circumstances. I think a lot of the adoption that's happening at the moment, they're not done in the right structure. Because there is children who does need support and need new home, and I totally see the point of why a new family to be there to support them and to love them is important. But for me, it's that to making sure that actually the child receive emotional, cultural, and anything that's a need. And I don't always see that. I've spoken to so many adoptees over the years, and most of them had no support at all. And I think that's where I found it difficult. Personally, if you ask me if I would adopt, I would say no, because of my own personal experience. Because I think you need a lot. It's not just about love. You need a lot more than just love to be able to adopt a child. And I don't know if I have the capacity to provide all the emotional support that child will need. I know some people will argue that, it's better for me to offer a home and a loving place for a child. But from my own experience, it's equally important to have that emotional support. So that's the main reason why I couldn't adopt. It's a very personal, I think, decision to adopt. And I mean,
I'm not looking for you to give it like a definitive answer, because I think that it is complicated, and you don't have to have a decision. You don't have to have a stance on it. You don't have to.
And also, my other issue about a lot of the adoption from Africa is some of those children still have parents over there, and they have not been abandoned. So there is this almost like a trafficking of children going on, that I don't agree. I think if the parents are still there and able to look after the child, even if they are in poverty, I think the parents should be able to look after them, and we should be providing support to that family somehow. But because also the separation, I think that is a very big deal. Being separated from a mother, a child separated from the parents, create a lot of trauma as well. And the loss of that family and that culture is so deep in themselves that I think that in itself, for me, it's not valid enough to adopt the child. And I have a real problem with people adopting, knowing that the parent of the child is still out there.
Yeah. You say you're an adoption coach and you support other adoptees. So can you tell me a little bit about that, what the work you do and how you got into that?
Well, I got into it. I trained as a coach, and actually originally I was going to be, because I do a lot of work with arts and culture organizations. So originally I actually trained to be a coach, to be a creative leader coach. So I was going to work with leaders within arts and culture organization, and coach them in those areas that they need in terms of leadership. But as more and more I was looking into my adoption and how it has affected me, I wanted then to move into supporting adoptees. So the work I do is really very much about talking with the adoptees about who they are and what their stories are and where they want to be in life. A lot of people confuse coaching and therapy, which is very different, because in my line of coaching, I do not deal with all the traumas that adoptee would have faced. That would be the work of the therapist. So I will be only looking at how they navigate their current story to get where they want to be, what their ideal identity would be, and how they can navigate through those process. But I know that it's very connected. So I work very connected also with therapists. So if it came to a moment when an adoptee is in difficulty, then I will have to refer them to a therapist. But yeah, so my work is very much just supporting from the present to the future, to get them to be who they want to be, and get to that identity that they want to become.
So how can people, if people want to find out a bit more about yourself or want to get in touch or see some of the work that you've produced, how can people do that?
The best place is to go to my website. So it's christellepellicuer.com. And yeah, everything is there. So all the information about my coaching, also all the creative work I've done in the past. You find if people who've worked with me have left some testimonials, so you can see also what people think about the work I've been doing. And I'm also going to be launching a podcast where I'll be having conversation with Black adoptees about their identity and how they navigate their own story. So that will be coming up in June.
What's that called?
Black Adoptees Identities.
Right. Well, we'll put the links to all of that into the show notes as well, so people can definitely follow that and link into that. And if they want to contact you directly, they can do that, because that feels like I feel like we've sort of just scratched the surface of your story. But I just really appreciate that you being so open and honest and candid about your experience. And I think that people will want to know more, and they know where to get you. And obviously then they can start to hear you on your own podcast, which sounds really exciting. And I'll certainly be subscribing and finding out more. So Christelle, thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate what you've said, and look after yourself.
Thank you for having me.